So the starting materials needed to make bread are 6 cups of flour, 1 1/2 tablespoons of yeast, 2/3 cup of sugar, 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt, 2 cups of water, and finally 1/4 cup of oil. So the first step in making bread is adding the yeast and sugar to 2 cups of warm water. The yeast are single-cell fungi capable of fermentation, so it consumes sugar such as glucose and releases the byproducts of ethanol and carbon dioxide. So as I'm adding it here, we're going to leave it here to sit for 5 minutes, and the yeast will consume the glucose, resulting in a bubbly, frothy layer on the surface of the solution. This is because the yeast is consuming the glucose from the sugar added and releasing carbon dioxide, resulting in this bubbly layer, which should be forming in about like 5 minutes. So here I sped it up, and as you can see, the yeast is consuming the sugar and releasing carbon dioxide all the way from the bottom to the top. Next, we add the oil and salt to the solution in a larger container and mix thoroughly while gradually adding the flour in order to make the dough for the bread. The flour contains gluten proteins, and when water is added, the proteins form hydrogen bonds and disulfide crosslinks, forming a more solid structure for the dough. The flour additionally contains starch, which are essentially long chains of sugar molecules. The yeast in this step has maltase, and maltase converts these chains into usable glucose, which is consumed by the yeast and used for fermentation. The oil in this step weakens the gluten network that is formed from the water, allowing for a softer resultant bread. It also stabilizes the gas bubbles that form from the CO2 released from the yeast, allowing the bread to have more volume. The salt in this step, while additionally adding flavor to the bread, also strengthens the gluten network by giving the dough more elasticity. This prevents the bread from being too airy and having some firmness to it. As we gradually add our 6 cups of flour to our reaction mixture, the mixture becomes more and more viscous, changing from a liquid phase to a more solid phase. As we continue to knead the dough, the viscoelastic network begins to become more stronger. Therefore, we move it out of the bowl and lay it out on the countertop in order to knead it. We knead it in order to in order to control the consistency of the dough, in order to make sure it's not too firm or too soft. We do this for quite some time because we need to make sure the dough doesn't stick to our hands anymore and make sure all the water has been properly encapsulated within the dough. Here we have finally finished kneading the dough and gotten the consistency and smoothness that we like. Now we place it into a container and cover it with a paper towel. This allows the bread to rise from the carbon dioxide being released from the fermentation by the yeast. We leave this for about an hour, and when we come back, we see that the dough has almost tripled in size. Next, we will portion out our bread into our desired portions. and later put it in the oven. Before we put it in the oven, however, we will leave it in a container for about 20 minutes in order to allow the bread to rise some more and reach a level of fluffiness, because after kneading it, we lost some of its airiness that we wanted. We now put the dough in the oven at 350 degrees for around 30 to 45 minutes, and as you can see, the bread is now completed. It has a hardened crust, and if you were to cut open inside the bread, you would see that there are tiny holes that are formed from the carbon dioxide releasing from the yeast.